Okay, and I will not repeat the welcome here, but for folks watching back, hi, I'm Alison Campbell. We're here to talk about summer slowdown, mindset, and microhabits. So we're going to dive in. Session chapters today, we're going to do a brief overview, so some warning signs. We're going to talk about chronic stress signals to really pay attention to and take notice and to see if any of these are showing up for you or they have in the past. And then we're going to spend the majority of time on the practices themselves. And so you're probably here. I probably don't need to read any statistics, but you're probably here today because you've experienced in the past, or maybe you're feeling right now some of what can, be described as chronic stress, maybe overwhelm, maybe a feeling of I'm working really hard and I love my job, I love my life, but I feel pretty maxed out every day. And I think that is a pretty common feeling these days. And so, I talk to folks every single day, whether it's clients at events, networking and meeting people who, have that collective exhale. When I say that my company is unburnt and I'm working on burnout prevention solutions at work, it feels pretty universal these days that most folks, because of our modern workplaces being hybrid, this information overload that we find ourselves in with just always being on, always having inbound communication coming at us. Now, with the rise of AI disrupting workflows and roles, there's just so much to contend to, right? And we're pretty maxed out every single day. And so, globally, I think folks are finding themselves not only in a state of overwhelm, but in the place where, upon reflection, it's beginning to really impact people's personal well-being, physical health. So Headspace does a workforce state of mind survey every year. Last year, 77% of respondents said that workplace stress is poorly impacting their physical health. I mean, that's a staggering stat. In the UK, similarly, 70% of UK workers are really struggling to turn it off. And so when we think about the impact that's having, we're going to get into a bit of what's happening under the hood from a physiological standpoint. But at a very high level, according to the research, there are three major burnout hallmarks to pay attention to. And so there's the top level, how do we define burnout? But then there's also how does it manifest and how does it show up, and the experience is so different for everybody. So we're going to go through both. We'll kick it off here first with definitions and then go into how chronic stress really impacts us as people and then some of the symptoms that show up as a result. So I think, number one here, I think we can all really recognize and relate to the feeling of exhaustion, right? When we think of burnout, when we think of chronic stress, we connect to that feeling of, oh yeah, I've been exhausted. Or when people tell me they're burnt out, I automatically I connect that to they must be super fatigued, overwhelmed, depleted, right? And so that one I think is pretty well understood. But number two and three, these are pretty surprising for me when they came up in the research, though I had felt both of them. So number two, according to the research, it's a feeling of cynicism. It's a feeling of you're kind of stuck in a grind and things start to become quite negative. And so even as a really positive and optimistic person, I found myself in those final months really feeling cynical, right? Like I was sitting in meetings thinking, nothing's going to change. This is, we're going through the same sort of Groundhog's Day, repeating old things. And while in the past, I was able to look at that and kind of flip the Rubik's Cube over and look at it and see, okay, how do we rally and really put a positive plan here? Or how do we look at this in a much more solution based way? In those final months when I was really, really burnt out, it just started to feel, I noticed that I was starting to feel really cranky. I didn't realize, though, that that was a hallmark of burnout. And then the last one, for me, this one really hits hard and is so sad when I hear from women, working moms, really any professional that starts to get into a space of really questioning their own abilities. So that feeling, when I left, was certainly I had experienced burnout. I went through surgery, and I had this moment of, was I even good at my job? Like, what am I qualified to do? You really start to question your own abilities because when we're in a state of chronic stress, it's cognitive overload, right? We're not in a place of emotional regulation. We are, pretty dysregulated. We're going to go through that a bit more in a moment. But it's not that we're not good at our jobs, right? Maybe we're not quite in the right fit from a role perspective or a workplace perspective, but it's really, we start to unfortunately get in that place of overdrive. Maybe we're making some mistakes. Maybe we have some foggy thinking. And so all of a sudden, though, that reflection comes on ourselves. It feels like a personal failure when actually we're not able as humans to operate at our best when we're stuck in a state of chronic stress. And so here's what's going on. Just quick refresher. I think most of us are familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze phenomenon. But I think, we sort of learn it, we know it, it flies past us in the peripheral, we know stress is bad. But in the context of work, it's not just a stressor like I almost got to a car accident, right? Or something that feels really heavy from a, family medical situation. In the context of work, something as seemingly innocuous as, you know, waiting for a response on a project or there's maybe been some rifts, some reduction in force, layoffs, and we're waiting maybe for the next shoe to drop, right? So we're in this state of anticipation, worry, certainly in our modern workplaces, a state of overwork, trying to do more with less resources. And so that those threats, whether real, I've got 5 projects I've got to get done by next week, I don't have enough time to do them, or perceived, I'm really worried. Is there going to be another layoff? All of those things are drivers that activate our stress response. And so as a result, we in the moment get a shot of adrenaline, right? So that's our body's way of responding to the threat immediately. And then it signals to our body that if that stressor doesn't go away immediately, we need to release cortisol, right? And I think we're all familiar with that. But again, in the context of work, in the context of always on, people being able to reach us, text, Slack, email, right? Name a channel. We're sort of always available, always on. We're stuck in this state of chronic stress, right? And so as a result, it impacts every single system in our body. And I won't drain, this slide and talk about the physiological responses across every single system, but rest assured, it starts to really take toll. There's wear and tear. If we stay stuck in a state of chronic stress, it shows up differently for everyone, but it starts to really have an impact. And as I mentioned in my experience, it could be things like headaches, foggy thinking, stomach aches. It could be decision fatigue, right? I'm context switching constantly. I get to Friday, I can't even decide what I want to have for dinner. Like I've made too many decisions this week. It's just too much. It's overload, right? We know that stress is associated with high blood pressure. Sleep is disturbed. Because we're in a state of emotional dysregulation, sometimes we're less compassionate, and that can show up as being really irritable at work. It's not who we want to be. It's not, we're not really, showing up the way we would be normally if we were rested. And so all of these things are signs and signals potentially of, the symptoms of burnout. And so it's really important to notice. We're going to talk about some ways that we can get, a little bit of that pause, and we'll go through some exercises to take stock. But if these things are happening persistently, if anything I've talked about, is feeling like it's a pattern, even after some days off or rest, I'm still feeling super overwhelmed. It could be something else is going on, and it's really, really important to talk to your healthcare provider. But if there's no underlying illness, it's you're not coming off of the flu, nothing else is going on, it could be a sign of chronic stress and potentially burnout. And so I think the first thing I talk to folks about is that just starting to really notice if if and when anything on this list is becoming persistent, to then start to build awareness around triggers and kind of causing back to what's potentially causing the underlying stress. I'm going to pause there before we get into the habits, because that was a little bit of the theoretical overview. Any questions? I saw a couple of things pop up in the chat about also feeling this. Any questions before we go into the habits, though, about being in a state of stress? And welcome to anyone that joined after we kicked off. See, we have a
I was
couple
just gonna say,
of
yeah, I was just
thoughts.
gonna say, like, I agreed with like everything that you're saying, and it was one of these things where, when this was going on for me before, I also just was like, oh, this is just the norm. This is just what happens when you're at this level at a startup and raising two kids. You know, like I think I always just felt like it was like what happened, and like that was like the norm. So
Yeah.
I think
It's
that's like
such
a
a
scary part.
common, I know, and it's such a common reflection, personally. And now that I'm doing this work, I think so many of us, because we were raised to believe like we can get after it, we can have it all, we can do it all, the sky's the limit. Those are incredible messages. And at the same time, in this always on world that we find ourselves in, the messages around rest, rest equals when you're done with everything, or as parents, we feel really guilty because when we kind of close out the workday, we want to make sure we're super present and showing up for all the kids' activities, which doesn't leave a whole ton of space for rest and pause. And so many of us have normalized it, right? Like, well, this is what it is. This is what I signed up for. And the reality is and we'll talk about baking all of this in, but with consistent ways to build sustainable habits, like we can show up, it can be more sustainable. Today's session is very much, in my opinion, only half the equation, right? We have to look at a lot of the systemic barriers inside of workplaces. You know, why why is it so hard to be able to create uh, workflows that really work for everybody, where we can carve out these spaces, for rest? So we're not talking about that side of the equation today. We are talking about personal habits, but it's so true that so many of us have normalized exhaustion is just part of the menu for this stage of life. And I think, I'm glad that folks here today are interested in potentially what something different could look like. So thank you, Lindsay, for that input. So we're going to get into some of the micro habits. And I think it's just important to note here before we do that when we think about breaking the stress cycle, right? So we went through perceived or real threats, what happens physiologically within our bodies. We sort of know, again, similar to fight or flight, we know stress is bad. We know that for the most part, things like exercise, moving our bodies, whether it's walking or running. We know that, meditation, journaling, gratitude, connecting with other people. Ironically, one of the biggest things, an antidote to burnout, is connection. And ironically, the reason why it's ironic is because that's usually the first thing that gets cut from the list, right? We're so tired that, if we had dinner with friends on a Thursday night, it kind of feels like the last thing we want to do, when it's actually one of the things that will help restore us and refuel us and kind of break the circuit of ongoing stress. But unfortunately, we deprioritize things that don't feel quote unquote, mission critical on our to-do lists. And so we sort of know it. It's not information gaps necessarily. In my opinion, it really comes down to a time gap. We are so scheduled down to the minute. We have so much going on all the time that it's not that we don't know that some of these things could be helpful. It's kind of like, how do we bake in time? How do we find space to do things to sustain wellness over time? And so when we think about micro habits, I've developed a variety of things across different categories. And it's been really important to me that I try to reflect and connect back to the science, right? So, what is happening when we're in a state of chronic stress? What is happening in burnout? And then, what are some practices and anecdotes to break the circuit? And so, today, we're going to focus on pause. Um, there's a number of other things. And if anyone's interested after today, I can follow up with other practices. I have some free resources on my website. Today, we're going to focus on pause. Really, the goal of pausing is to get back into regulation, right? So we want to activate our prefrontal cortex. It's kind of that executive functioning where we have control. We're not in emotional dysregulation. We're not just reacting. We're not exhausted and fatigued, right? And so this is the piece we're going to focus on today. But there are, a variety of other things we know we need to be doing. But again, the key is making space, making them consistent, finding things, whether it's a micro habit as little as 5 minutes or consistent breaks in our day to work in some of these other things super, super important. So I just wanted to start by saying it's not just the pause moments. There are, a number of other things that we want to be baking in. But from a pause perspective, let's dive in a little bit deeper into the cognitive benefits. So I mentioned earlier decision fatigue. If anyone pop in the chat, just that feeling of going from meeting to meeting, and you're, going from something as um, maybe simple as a quick decision that could be made, and theoretically it could be an on the spot decision, to something that requires much deeper strategic thinking. And by the end of the day, after going through, it just feels like, oh my gosh, I'm actually exhausted just from the sheer volume of calls, the decisions I've had to make, and all of the different topics I've worked through, right? It's so many folks I talk to, it feels like we're going from meeting to meeting without space to really reflect, to absorb information, right? We want to be able to absorb to then make a more informed decision. And it just kind of feels like we can't. Like we're on the fly, we just have to keep moving. And the pace, if we don't keep up, it's going to keep moving without us, right? And so that really decreases our ability, of course, to focus, to be flexible and agile, which is a tremendous thing to remain competitive in the workforce today. And so when we are pausing, we're giving ourselves that space to reclaim some of that focus, of course. It's helping us to reset. And from a nervous system standpoint, we are, whether it's deep breathing, so a tactical practice could be as simple as, I'm going to give myself 5 minutes before my next meeting. So every single meeting, I'm going to end on the 55. I'm going to, step away from my computer, and I'm just going to take 2 to 5 minutes for deep breathing, right? That activates it tells our body that we're safe, essentially, right? And it seems silly. It's one of the practices that I now have in my back pocket toolkit. And if I'm starting to feel that overwhelm creeping up, I, forgot, oh my gosh, it's the last week of school. I've got to get a couple more gifts, whatever it may be. You feel that overwhelm creeping up. For me, it's just a go-to habit now. Couple of deep breaths. I think, 5 years ago, Allison probably would have laughed, but it is super powerful, and it's always with us. And so it's one of those little tips that you can put in your toolkit, and just remember to breathe. As simple as it sounds, super, super powerful. And so, as a follow on to this, I will send a few breathing exercises as part of the recap, but that's just a tactical practice. The next one is the how. It's about blocking and actually honoring the commitments on our calendar, right? So, again, to be able to interrupt that cycle, we want to be decreasing the cortisol levels. We don't want it flowing forever and start to really feel that wear and tear on our body. We have to create that space in our day, right? Because so often we're just doing the doing. And if we don't kind of pre-plan and say, you know what, I'm going to have a block of some deep focus. Maybe I have an afternoon of some calls. If we don't pre-plan that 30-minute block in the middle of the day to actually eat, to step away from our screens, it sort of doesn't happen. And so one of the things I advise, again, as a tactical practice, is actually looking at your calendar to figure out where you can bake in 15 minutes of micro breaks throughout your week. And it does require us taking a look to say, I you know, first of all, it requires us to take a look, but it also requires us to acknowledge, going back to back is something that will keep me in a state of, feeling that pressure and overwhelm. So how can I kind of re-architect small little things I can do to bake in 15 minutes and actually honor those commitments? Because I used to be someone that would put buffers on my calendar and then work right through them. And those were kind of just like, oh, those are fun. They're in a different color. Those are nice to see. But I didn't really honor them as the breaks that, I had thought that I'd be using them for. So we've got to make space. Super tactical, but taking a look at our calendar and baking those in. And then the last piece, before we get into the exercises, we're going to kind of work through some stuff together, is screen-free breaks. And again, this seems super basic, but the reason why this is important is because we are in cognitive overload all the time. And so when we think about the amount of information, not only, coming through all the different channels that we can receive from work and from our personal lives, even just the anticipated, oh my gosh, was I'm waiting for an email. I didn't hear the ding. The anticipation of getting something, let alone actually seeing it, show up as a notification, that keeps us in a state of chronic stress, right? Me having my phone here and then looking down and realizing that, oh, I've got a number of notifications. I've got to go back to those. We get distracted, right? It's a mini context switch. And our threat perception of something maybe coming is elevated almost all the time. So when people think, okay, I'm going to take a break, I'm going to mindlessly scroll. Again, no, this is coming from a place of no judgment, by the way, because I'm someone who likes to look at funny reels, and we all use different things as outlets to take breaks. But the reality is, scrolling mindlessly on social media, or taking a walk away from our computer, but then catching up on all of our personal texts, those aren't breaks. And so it's just really important to recognize that and commit to ourselves. Hey, I'm gonna maybe put 15-minute block at 3 o'clock. I'm gonna stretch, I'm gonna walk around, and I'm gonna keep my phone in a drawer somewhere because I need to break, you know both from a movement perspective and give my brain a break from all the stimuli happening on my phone all day long. Okay, so exercises. We're going to pop in. If there are questions or anything that, as follow-ons, I can provide as resources, just as it relates to some of these tactical practices, let me know. But we're going to dive in. So we have two exercises to help really solidify these pause moments throughout our days and our weeks. And so the first one is what I call the wellness win. It's what I need now. And the second one is sentence stems to just help us really reflect on some mindset reframes. So we're going to jump into wellness first. So, in terms of building micro habits, the first thing we really need to do, as I mentioned, in terms of awareness, is notice and really recognize what it is that personally for us works in terms of interventions. Because I could come here with a list of things, meditate, journal for 15 minutes. And if that doesn't resonate or that doesn't work for you as a stress interrupter, that's probably going to add more stress to your plate, right? It's like more things to do, and it's, maybe not something that's going to be helpful. And so what we need to do is really assess, what are some things I can do if I'm thinking 20 minutes or less. You have to first kind of build that menu of options for yourself so that you have go-to practices that you can kind of flip on throughout your week, right? And so this is not, let me create a menu of all of these things I have to do every single day. It's really more establishing practices that become habitual, right? You are noticing from a physical health perspective, yeah, breaking and walking around. We're entering beautiful summer months. Get outside. I can walk around for 15 minutes. That's super helpful. Or I'm getting up from my desk at work and I'm stepping outside. I'm not just, doing a lap around the office. This though is it's really important to cultivate for ourselves a list of those go-to habits. And so I have in here, these are the different categories. And what I'm going to do is pop up some examples. These are thought starters, some of which I do, some of which are just things that have come up, in research or in other peer-reviewed journals. This is, a place to start, but the time here that we're going to spend, I'm going to give everyone about 5 minutes. This is really for you. This is to take space. We so seldom have a moment to really sit down and think, what is on my checklist, right? So often we start our days, our Monday mornings with, okay, what didn't get done last week? Or, okay, what's coming up this week? And we make our to-do lists, which are full of things for work, maybe for the kids, for other obligations we have, but so seldom do we actually sit down and say, what should be on my wellness checklist? So this is space for you to do that today. I'm going to keep this slide up here. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to go through each of these categories: physical health, rest, which is a combination of breaks and sleep, mental health, metabolic health, and emotional health. If anyone has questions on distinctions, pop them in the chat or feel free to come off mute. This is an example to give you some thought starters around what potentially could be in each category, but this is really space for you to reflect and to think. If I wanted to layer in some go-to habits, almost think of it as baseline needs in a given week that you can reflect on. Like, okay, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. Did I drink enough water today? As basic 101 as that sounds, it's super, super helpful to establish these practices in a way where you can call them up and then deploy things, maybe one a day, a couple a day, and they become second nature to you. So I see we have a question in the chat. Should they be doable in 20 minutes or in general, no time constraints? So for today's purposes, when we're thinking about the summer, it's such a great shifting of seasons, right? The school year ends if you have kids, warmer days, longer evenings. It's a great time to think about new micro habits. So the intention here is that we're thinking of things, call it 20 minutes or less, that you can layer in. But if you have a couple of things on here that you're like, you know what, I actually want to use this change of season to recommit to, I'm making it up, a 30-minute run 3 times a week, right? If you want that to be on your wellness win checklist, go for it. The idea here is that we're cultivating things that we want to be able to commit to. Again, a couple of new things a week that we want to say, I'm going to call these practices up if it starts to feel overwhelming or before it even gets to that point. So this is really for you. I think most of the practice here is just carving out the space today to sit down and really reflect. What do I need across these categories, right? What are things I can do? And if it's 20 minutes or less, great. But if it's longer than that and you want to sort of calendar those in and recommit, that's awesome too. So I'm gonna go on mute and stop talking. If there are questions in the chat, I will answer those in the chat so that we can have just a quiet 5 minutes for you all to reflect on this and think about it. Okay, so as folks are wrapping up, hopefully this is something that you can take with you and reflect on a bit more after today's session. But did anything come up for anyone? I think for me, I'll share as a starting point. I didn't really recognize, even working from home in my corporate role, I'm a very organized person. I like things to be sort of in their place, but there were some days where I had notes and to-dos and things all over my desk here. And so the simple act of, a couple of times a week, really tidying up my home office went a really long way when I started to really notice that physical clutter was translating to mental clutter. So that's just one teeny tiny example of, for me, making sure that that was part of my sort of on my go-to checklist, if you will, on an ongoing basis. Did anything come up for folks? Vacuuming, love it. Yes, I do too. We're in the tidying up camp, Pete. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to start to notice the little things we can do, whether it's in our environment, whether it's, I have a calendar prompt at 8:45. I'm not going to bed at 8:45, let's be real, but I do have a prompt on my phone that says wind down, right? And then at my focus time, basically I stop getting notifications at 9 p.m. It's just these little shifts where I want to be cognizant. I can, choose to power through that. And if I'm doing something one evening, absolutely change course. But for the most part, I want to start powering down and not, being necessarily tied to my device starting at 9 p.m. Right. So these are like the little shifts that I'm starting to work in and really honor as commitments to maintain my sanity through very busy weeks and months. Anything else coming up? We have laughter. I love that. 5 minute stand up, 100%. Reading for fun. Love that. How do we avoid the suck zone? Yes. Well, I think we have to maybe sometimes set a timer. I don't know. Like it's sort of up to us to decide how we want to break and then how we want to come back. But yeah, all of these things I think are about building awareness, right? And what's in your go-to practices, things that all right, I'm starting to feel foggy, or there's been several days of just busyness. Like, what do I need to do to get back to feeling well? So I invite you all to continue to think through this, reflect on it, and try things. Summer, again, is a really great shift of seasons to, try some new things, try to layer in some new practices. That's not to say that we're clogging up our calendar with a whole bunch of new things that we feel like we have to keep up with, but just having these little interceptions, these little breaks that we can start to notice. Yeah, you know what? It's crazy, but 20 minutes later, I felt really so much better. Those are the types of sustainable habits we want to be building in. All right. So we're going to go to the next thing. The next practice I came across actually during my coaching certification about a year ago. It was about building reframes, right? So, how do we intercept sometimes what feels like self limiting or negative thoughts? How do we connect to, from idea or feeling to maybe an action plan in a way that feels really positive? For me, this really, really resonated, right? So as I was thinking through, doing a lot of self-discovery, thinking through potentially even from a business plan perspective for unBurnt, I'll share very openly, really working through going from idea to actionable plan. I use this framework to help me. And so sentence stems is a way to pause what you're going to do. And I'll give you examples on the next slide. You want to think through either a limiting belief or something that is helping us or not helping us. It's we're feeling stuck, right? It's not a helpful thought construct. And so we want to think about the outcome, but not the how yet. So you create a sentence based on that stated goal. And again, it helps us to really notice what's coming up. It helps us to connect ideas and feelings to, building agency around a plan. And so this feels super theoretical right now. Let me show you that in practice. You might think, yes, we're shifting seasons. Yes, it's summer, but I still have to work, right? And so one thought or one opportunity that you're identifying is I always feel tired and there's no time to pause. There's, I don't get summer breaks the way I used to when I was little and I had summer off. Whatever it may be, the first piece is to notice the opportunity. So I feel super stressed out at work. I have so much to do and not enough time to do it, right? I should be able to handle this. This was a major, major stumbling block for me personally. I kept coming back to, this is what I signed up for. I wanted to be an executive, wanted to be a mom. I should be able to do all of this. I'm looking at other people and I feel like everyone else can. Um, we shouldn't be doing the comparison thing, right? So the shoulds, that's usually a sign. If we have that thought construct, notice it, write it down. And then the sentence is not necessarily we're not going to problem solve right away, but we're going to try to say, for example, all right, I'm always tired. So tomorrow, to feel more rested, I will. And maybe it's something you just identified when we did our wellness checklist. It could be something about prioritizing, right? So I have so much to do, and we get stuck in this swirl of, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. I can't possibly take a break. You're telling me to pause. You're telling me the benefits of why it's important, but I've got 10,000 things on my list, so I can't possibly stop, right? That it feels counterintuitive to say I'm going to be able to make space for some pauses throughout the summer. I want you to then start the sentence, and this is just a for instance, it's up to you to craft it however resonates with you, but to prioritize the most important things, I will. And so you start to really notice then when you complete the sentence, that's where you build your plan, right? And the I will can be what you're going to do tomorrow. It could be here are the things I'm going to do this summer. There's maybe some projects I'm going to pause. Maybe I was overly ambitious. This is personal. Thinking this summer I was going to clean the basement and clean the garage and do all of these things that help me feel more tidied up. But maybe if I sit back and think about being able to take some time with the kids, still keep the business going, really enjoy the season, maybe that's not realistic, right? So maybe the way we're going to prioritize is actually pausing some stuff. Um, Anytime that the should construct comes up, it might be helpful to notice why you're feeling that way, and then maybe a helpful mindset shift to think about it in a different dimension. So I'm gonna again pause. I will be kind of monitoring chat if any questions come up. At first, it feels super awkward. I remember going through this again and not really like quite sure how to structure a sentence. It's really a free for all. It's really about noticing and then doing the reframe. But I'll be monitoring chat if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to go on mute and give you folks a couple of minutes to work on this. All right, so coming back on here because I want to make sure I leave some time at the top before the next hour, and just to wrap up here, any questions, any reflections as we complete this. So hopefully this is a helpful practice that you can kind of flip to, use it anytime. It's a way to just kind of reframe some thoughts, or if we're starting to feel super stressed, overwhelmed, you can craft a sentence stem to kind of figure out where you want to take it. So hopefully that was helpful. And so let's do a little pulse check here. Have a nice little video. watch watch the water. It always calms me. Any questions, any thoughts that are coming up that would be helpful to answer before we close out today? And no worries if not. Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate that. So, as a wrap up, what I will do is send out the recording. I have a couple of practices that I'll send as supplemental material. So, a breathing exercise. I have some resources on my website, which I'll point you to as well. And yeah, hopefully these are things that you can deploy. I think it's really helpful. I've written about this in some newsletters, but I think super helpful to take stock. And now at the front end of summer, while of course, whether we're working, if we work with our kids this summer, of course, the to-dos and the stuff never stops. But I think we have an opportunity to, sort of take a look at the summer and be mindful of a couple of days, if we can squeeze them out, that can be obligation free just for us. Really thinking about holistic wellness days for us, um, thinking about ways that we can incorporate some of these micro breaks, some of the things that we identified on the wellness win checklist. These are all things that in combination starts to really surround ourselves in sustainable support. And so as you think about your summer, now is a really great time to kind of map out maybe where some of those additional breaks can be if you haven't already. And then I did just want to mention, I announced as a kickoff yesterday in a newsletter that I'm going to be launching a 4-week, really tight, really rapid uh, group cohort session all around all 5 categories in the microhabit shifts. So if this resonated, if you want to learn more, I have information on the website, or feel free to email me. We're going to go through essentially before the busyness of end of year. So before we get into fall, Q4, hard to believe I'm even saying that. But before we get into the craziness that is basically Q4, end of year, holiday prep, all of it, taking some space to really go through an expanded version of the microhabits framework to develop habits and your essentially your 12-month well plan heading into that busy season. So if that resonates and you want to learn more, feel free to reach out to me. And otherwise, let's stay connected. So I do free sessions about once a month. I am pausing in July and August, just given um, I think everyone hopefully is trying to take advantage of vacation and some time off in various pockets throughout the summer. So I'm pausing in July and August, but continue to check out the website or on LinkedIn as I announce other free workshops, and let's just stay connected. Really, really appreciate you taking some time today to hop on and prioritize you. I'm just looking at the chat here. Thank you so much. Great comments. Love that you guys are going to leverage the wellness win. Awesome. All right. Well, we can wrap it there. Thank you guys so much for joining, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.